On the morning of December 29, 2003, in the small coastal town of Biddeford, Maine, a woman named Amy St. Pierre walked out of her apartment to run errands, leaving her infant daughter in the care of a trusted babysitter. She returned home 4 hours later to find her 11-month-old child, Cassidy Bortner, unresponsive, bruised, and struggling to breathe. By that evening, Cassidy was gone. The medical examiner would later determine that the little girl had suffered catastrophic injuries consistent with severe physical trauma. The babysitter, a young woman named Heather Schellen, insisted nothing had happened. But in the quiet rooms of the Biddeford Police Department, investigators began to notice something troubling. The details didn't align, the timeline felt stretched and thin, and the person who had been alone with Cassidy seemed far too calm for someone who had just witnessed a child stop breathing. The question that would haunt this community for months, and then years, was simple and terrible. What really happened in those 4 hours? Biddeford sits along the southern coast of Maine, a working-class city where the Saco River empties into the Atlantic Ocean. In 2003, it was a town of about 20,000 people, a place where paper mills had once provided steady work, where neighbors knew each other's names, and where winters arrived early and stayed late. The streets were lined with triple-decker homes, their paint peeling from salt air and neglect. Downtown, small businesses struggled to compete with shopping centers spreading across the highway. It was the kind of place where young families moved hopping to find affordable housing and a sense of community, where babysitters were found through friends of friends, where trust was given easily because everyone seemed to know everyone else. Amy St. Pierre was 21 years old that December. She worked at a local dental office, a job that required her to be organized, punctual, and presentable. She had moved to Biddeford with her boyfriend, Jeffrey Bortner, and their daughter, Cassidy, hopping to build a stable life. Cassidy was 11 months old, with soft brown hair and wide eyes, just beginning to pull herself up on furniture, just starting to babble sounds that might one day become words. Amy's days followed a routine. Wake before dawn, feed Cassidy, dress her in tiny corduroy pants and soft cotton shirts, prepare the diaper bag with bottles and wipes and extra clothes, drop her off at the babysitter's apartment, drive to work, answer phones, file paperwork, smile at patients, pick up Cassidy in the late afternoon, go home, give her a bath, read her a story, put her to bed. It was ordinary and precious and exhausting in the way that caring for an infant always is. Heather Schellen was 19 years old. She lived in a small apartment on Graham Street, just a few blocks from Amy's place. She had been babysitting Cassidy for several weeks, watching her during the days when Amy worked. Those who knew Heather described her as quiet, maybe a little reserved, someone who kept to herself. She had a boyfriend who sometimes stayed over. She had talked about wanting to work with children, maybe becoming a daycare provider someday. Amy had felt fortunate to find her, someone close by, someone affordable, someone who seemed responsible. The morning of December 29 was cold. The temperature hovered in the low 20s, and a thin layer of frost covered the car windows. Amy bundled Cassidy in a pink snowsuit, the kind with mittens attached to the sleeves. She packed the diaper bag carefully, 4 bottles of formula, a container of baby food, diapers, a change of clothes, Cassidy's favorite stuffed animal, a small blue elephant she liked to hold when she slept. Amy arrived at Heather's apartment around 8:30 in the morning. She carried Cassidy up the narrow stairs, knocked on the door, waited for Heather to open it. The apartment smelled like coffee and laundry detergent. Amy handed Cassidy over, gave Heather instructions about feeding times and nap schedules, kissed her daughter on the forehead, and left. She drove to work. She answered phones. She filed insurance forms. She thought about what to make for dinner that night. Around 12:30 that afternoon, Heather called Amy at work. Her voice was tight, urgent. She said Cassidy wasn't breathing. She said she had called an ambulance. Amy felt the floor tilt beneath her. She grabbed her coat and ran. When Amy arrived at the apartment, emergency responders were already there. Cassidy lay on the living room floor, her small body surrounded by paramedics working quickly, efficiently, desperately. Her lips were blue. Her eyes were closed. There were bruises on her face, on her arms, on her torso. The paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher and carried her down the stairs to the ambulance. Amy climbed in beside her daughter, holding her tiny hand, whispering her name over and over. At Southern Maine Medical Center, doctors worked for hours. They intubated Cassidy, gave her fluids, monitored her heart rate, her breathing, her brain activity. They noticed the bruises immediately, fresh contusions on her cheeks, her forehead, her ribs. They noticed swelling in her brain. They noticed retinal hemorrhaging in both eyes. The injuries were severe, catastrophic, the kind that don't happen from a fall or an accident. The kind that happen when force is applied, repeatedly, deliberately. By evening, the doctors told Amy there was nothing more they could do. Cassidy's brain had swollen beyond recovery. At 8:47 that night, she was pronounced deceased. In the waiting room, Amy collapsed into a chair. Jeffrey sat beside her, his face blank with shock. Detectives from the Biddeford Police Department arrived within the hour. They needed to ask questions. They needed to understand what had happened. They needed to speak with Heather Shellen. Part 2. The Investigation. The investigation began immediately, urgently, with the kind of focus that comes when a child has been harmed. Detective Sergeant Jeffrey Caldwell led the case. He was a veteran investigator, someone who had worked domestic incidents, assaults, and the occasional homicide. He arrived at Southern Maine Medical Center that night and spoke first with the attending physicians. They showed him photographs of Cassidy's injuries, bruises in various stages of healing, some fresh and purple, others yellowish-green and older. The pattern suggested repeated trauma over time, not a single incident. The doctors used words like non-accidental injury and inflicted trauma. They told Caldwell that in their medical opinion, these injuries were consistent with physical mistreatment. Caldwell drove to Heather Shellen's apartment on Graham Street. It was after midnight when he knocked on the door. Heather answered, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She invited him inside. The apartment was small and cluttered. A couch with mismatched cushions, a television playing quietly in the corner, toys scattered across the carpet. Caldwell sat down and asked Heather to tell him exactly what had happened that day. Heather spoke slowly, carefully. She said Cassidy had been fine all morning. She had given her a bottle around 9. She had changed her diaper. She had put her down for a nap around 10:30. Cassidy had slept for about an hour. When she woke up, Heather said, she seemed fussy. She gave her another bottle. She held her. She walked around the apartment with her. Around noon, Heather said, Cassidy started vomiting. Then she became lethargic. Then she stopped breathing. That's when Heather called the ambulance. Caldwell took notes. He asked about the bruises. Heather said she didn't know where they came from. She said Cassidy had been fine when Amy dropped her off. She said maybe Cassidy had bumped into something, maybe she had rolled off the couch while napping. Caldwell asked if anyone else had been in the apartment that day. Heather said no, she had been alone with Cassidy the entire time. Caldwell asked if he could look around. Heather said yes. He walked through the small apartment, examining each room. The living room showed no signs of a struggle, no blood, no obvious evidence of violence. The bedroom was tidy. The kitchen was clean. But in the bathroom, Caldwell noticed something. A towel on the floor, slightly damp, folded in a way that seemed deliberate. He photographed it. He also noticed that the apartment felt unusually warm, the heat turned up high despite the mild temperature outside. He made a note of it. Over the next several days, investigators worked methodically. They interviewed Amy St. Pierre, who told them Cassidy had been healthy that morning, happy, free of bruises. They interviewed Jeffrey Bortner, who confirmed the same. They interviewed neighbors in the building, asking if they had heard anything unusual that day, crying, shouting, any sounds of distress. Most said no. One neighbor, an elderly woman who lived directly below Heather's apartment, said she had heard thumping sounds around midday, like something heavy being dropped repeatedly on the floor. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. The medical examiner's report arrived on January 2, 2004. It was detailed, clinical, devastating. Cassidy Bortner had died from blunt force trauma to the head. She had suffered multiple skull fractures, subdural hemorrhaging, and brain swelling. She had bruises on her face, her chest, her arms, her legs. Some of the bruises were fresh, sustained within hours of her passing. Others were older, sustained days or weeks earlier. The medical examiner ruled the manner of her passing a homicide. Caldwell brought Heather Shellen in for another interview. This time he was more direct. He told her what the medical examiner had found. He told her that the injuries could not have been accidental. He asked her again what had happened. Heather maintained her story. She said she didn't know how Cassidy had been injured. She said she hadn't done anything to harm her. She said maybe Amy had done something before dropping Cassidy off. She said maybe Jeffrey had done something. She said she was just the babysitter. Caldwell pressed harder. He asked about the timeline. Heather said Cassidy had been fine until around noon, but the doctors had told Caldwell that the severity of Cassidy's injuries meant they had to have been inflicted hours before she stopped breathing, likely in the late morning. He asked Heather to explain the discrepancy. She couldn't, or wouldn't. She sat across from him, her arms crossed, her face expressionless, and repeated the same answers over and over. She didn't know, she hadn't done anything, Cassidy had been fine. Those who worked closely with Caldwell later said he became increasingly frustrated. The physical evidence pointed clearly to Heather. She had been the only adult with Cassidy during the critical time window. The injuries were fresh, and her story kept shifting in small but significant ways. But without a confession, without witnesses, without definitive proof, building a case would be difficult. The community of Biddeford reacted with shock and grief. Vigils were held. People left flowers and stuffed animals outside the apartment building on Graham Street. Local news stations ran stories about the case, showing photographs of Cassidy smiling in her mother's arms. Amy and Jeffrey gave a brief statement to the press, asking for anyone with information to come forward. They looked exhausted, hollowed out, moving through the motions of speech as if underwater. Heather Shellen was arrested on January 5, 2004, and charged with manslaughter. Prosecutors argued that she had intentionally harmed Cassidy, that the injuries were inflicted deliberately, and that Heather's changing statements showed consciousness of guilt. Heather's defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no direct proof Heather had caused the injuries, and that reasonable doubt existed. The trial was set for later that year. But then, quietly, something shifted. Witnesses who had initially agreed to testify became reluctant. Medical experts disagreed about the exact timing of the injuries. The defense presented alternative theories. Maybe Cassidy had a pre-existing condition. Maybe the injuries had occurred before she arrived at Heather's apartment. Maybe the investigation had been rushed. In November 2004, the prosecution offered a plea deal. Heather Shellen agreed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of endangering the welfare of a child. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison. She served 2. Amy St. Pierre was devastated. She felt the justice system had failed her daughter. She felt Cassidy's life had been valued at only 2 years behind bars. She moved away from Biddeford, unable to bear living in a town where her daughter's babysitter walked free. The case file was closed. The community moved on. Cassidy Bortner became another name on a list of children lost too soon. For years, that seemed to be the end of the story. Part 3. The Silence. 18 years passed. Amy St. Pierre rebuilt her life slowly, painfully, the way a person rebuilds after a fire has taken everything. She moved to a different town, found a different job, tried to create a version of herself that could function despite the weight she carried. She rarely spoke about Cassidy. Friends learned not to ask. The grief was too large, too raw, even after all those years. She kept photographs of Cassidy in a box in her closet, unable to look at them for long without feeling the room spin. On December 29 every year, she stayed home, turned off her phone, and allowed herself to remember. Jeffrey Bortner also moved away. He and Amy separated not long after the trial ended. The loss of their daughter had created a space between them that neither could cross. They spoke occasionally, brief conversations about paperwork or belongings, but mostly they lived separate lives, each trying to survive their own private version of the same nightmare. In Biddeford, life continued. New families moved into the apartment building on Graham Street. Children rode bicycles along the same sidewalks where Cassidy had been carried to the ambulance. The story became something people mentioned occasionally, a tragedy that had happened once, a long time ago, to people no one really knew anymore. Heather Shellen was released from prison in 2006. She moved to a neighboring town, changed her name, tried to disappear into anonymity. Those who knew what she had done whispered about it, but most people didn't know or didn't care or didn't want to dredge up old pain. She found work. She rented an apartment. She lived quietly. But for those who had worked the case, for Detective Caldwell and the prosecutors and the medical examiner, the memory lingered. They believed they knew what had happened. They believed Heather Shellen had harmed Cassidy Bortner intentionally, violently, and had been given a sentence that didn't match the severity of the act. But without new evidence, without a confession, there was nothing more they could do. The case was closed. Justice, such as it was, had been served. Then in the spring of 2022, something changed. A woman contacted the Biddeford Police Department. She identified herself as someone who had known Heather Shellen in the years following her release from prison. She said Heather had confided in her, slowly at first, then more openly. She said Heather had told her things about the day Cassidy passed, things that had never been part of the official record. The woman said she had kept quiet for years because she was afraid, because she wasn't sure anyone would believe her, because she didn't want to get involved. But the weight of the secret had become unbearable. She wanted to come forward. Detective Caldwell, now retired, was contacted by the current lead investigator. He agreed to come in and review the case file. He sat in the same conference room where he had interviewed Heather 18 years earlier and read through the notes, the photographs, the medical reports. Everything he remembered came flooding back. The small apartment, the damp towel in the bathroom, the way Heather had sat across from him with her arms crossed, saying over and over that she didn't know, she hadn't done anything. The woman who had come forward agreed to give a formal statement. She said that Heather had told her she had been overwhelmed that day, that Cassidy had been crying inconsolably, that she had lost control. She said Heather had described shaking Cassidy, striking her, throwing her down. She said Heather had admitted it, not in those exact words, but in fragments, in moments of vulnerability, in ways that left no doubt about what had really happened. The York County District Attorney's Office reviewed the new information. They consulted with the original prosecutors, with medical experts, with legal advisors. The question was simple but complex. Could they bring new charges? Heather had pleaded guilty to endangering the welfare of a child, but she had never been tried for manslaughter or more serious charges. Double jeopardy laws are complicated, but in this case, prosecutors determined that because Heather had only been convicted of a lesser charge, they could pursue more serious charges based on the new evidence. On October 12, 2022, Heather Shellen, now 38 years old and living under a different name, was arrested at her workplace. She was charged with manslaughter in the 2003 passing of Cassidy Bortner. The arrest made headlines across Maine. For Amy St. Pierre, the news was both a relief and a reopening of the deepest wound. She released a statement through her attorney. "For 18 years, I have lived with the knowledge that the person who took my daughter from me received almost no punishment. I am grateful that justice is finally being pursued, but no amount of time will bring Cassidy back." The community of Biddeford reacted with a mixture of shock and vindication. Those who remembered the case felt a kind of grim satisfaction. Those who didn't remember wondered how something like this could remain unresolved for so long. Local news stations ran retrospectives, showing old footage from 2003, interviewing people who had known the family, trying to piece together what had happened and why it had taken nearly 2 decades to reach this point. Part 4. The Revelation. The trial began in the spring of 2023. The courthouse in Alfred, Maine, was packed with spectators, journalists, and people who had followed the case for years. Amy St. Pierre sat in the front row every day, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed but strained. Jeffrey Bortner sat several rows behind her. They did not speak. The prosecution's case rested on several pillars. First, the medical evidence. The original autopsy report, which clearly stated that Cassidy's injuries were inflicted, not accidental. The medical examiner, now retired but still sharp and precise, testified that the pattern of bruising and the severity of the head trauma indicated repeated blunt force applied with significant strength. He said that in his professional opinion, these injuries could not have occurred from a fall or a bump or any kind of accident. They were the result of intentional violence. Second, the timeline. Cassidy had been healthy and uninjured when Amy dropped her off at Heather's apartment at 8:30 in the morning. By 12:30, she was unresponsive with catastrophic injuries. Heather had been the only adult present during that 4-hour window. The prosecution argued that the window of opportunity was narrow and clear. Third, the witness testimony. The woman who had come forward in 2022 took the stand. She described her relationship with Heather, how they had met through mutual friends, how Heather had gradually opened up about her past. She recounted specific conversations where Heather had admitted to losing control, to shaking Cassidy, to being responsible for what happened. Under cross-examination, the defense tried to discredit her, suggesting she was unreliable, that she might be misremembering or exaggerating. But she remained steady, her voice calm and certain. She repeated what Heather had told her, word for word. She said, "I didn't mean for it to happen, but I couldn't make her stop crying and I just lost it." The defense presented their case with a different narrative. They argued that the witness was not credible, that her statements were hearsay, that Heather had never explicitly confessed to causing Cassidy's injuries. They brought in their own medical expert, who suggested that some of Cassidy's injuries could have occurred before she arrived at Heather's apartment, that the timing of the trauma was not as clear-cut as the prosecution claimed. They pointed out that Heather had already served time for her role in Cassidy's passing, that she had accepted responsibility by pleading guilty in 2004, and that pursuing new charges now was unfair and unjust. Heather Shellen took the stand in her own defense. She was older now, her face lined with years, her voice quieter than it had been in 2003. She testified that she had never intentionally harmed Cassidy, that she had loved caring for children, that the plea deal in 2004 had been a pragmatic choice to avoid a longer sentence, not an admission of guilt for causing Cassidy's injuries. She said the statements the witness attributed to her were taken out of context, twisted, misunderstood. She said she had been describing her feelings of guilt and responsibility, not admitting to specific actions. She cried on the stand. She said she thought about Cassidy every day. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On the afternoon of May 18, 2023, they returned with a verdict, guilty of manslaughter. The courtroom was silent. Amy St. Pierre closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath for 18 years. Heather Shellen stared straight ahead, her face blank. At sentencing, the judge addressed Heather directly. He said that the evidence had shown, beyond reasonable doubt, that she had caused Cassidy Bortner's passing through intentional acts of violence. He said that her subsequent attempts to evade responsibility, her changing stories, and her efforts to minimize her actions had compounded the harm. He sentenced her to 20 years in prison. With time already served from her previous sentence, she would be eligible for parole in 15 years. Amy St. Pierre gave a victim impact statement. She spoke about Cassidy, about the daughter she had lost, about the milestones that would never happen. First words, first steps, first day of school, graduation, all the ordinary beautiful moments stolen. She spoke about the 18 years she had lived with the knowledge that the person responsible had been free, living a normal life, while Cassidy remained frozen at 11 months old. She said, "Justice delayed is not justice denied, but it is justice that came too late for my daughter. I hope that this conviction brings some measure of accountability, even if it can never bring her back." The media coverage was extensive. National outlets picked up the story, framing it as a cold case finally solved, a mother's long wait for justice, a system that had initially failed but ultimately delivered. Legal analysts debated the complexities of the case, the implications of charging someone nearly 2 decades after the fact, the role of new witness testimony in reopening old wounds. Public opinion was divided. Some believed Heather had already paid for her actions, that the plea deal should have been the end of it. Others believed that the initial sentence had been far too lenient, that Cassidy's life deserved more than 2 years behind bars. Heather Shellen is currently serving her sentence at the Maine Correctional Center. Her appeals have been denied. The case is closed. Closing. The story of Cassidy Bortner is not unique. It is one of thousands, tens of thousands of cases where a child was harmed by someone who was supposed to protect them. What makes it distinct is the long arc between the act and the accountability, the 18 years during which the truth existed but remained unspoken, known by some but not proven in a court of law. For Amy St. Pierre, the conviction did not bring Cassidy back. It did not erase the years of grief, the nights she woke up reaching for a daughter who wasn't there, the birthdays marked only by absence. But it provided something, recognition that what happened to Cassidy mattered, that her life had value, that the person who ended it could not simply walk away. Cassidy Bortner would be 22 years old now. She might have graduated from college, started a career, fallen in love, become whoever she was meant to become. Instead, she remains 11 months old forever, a child whose story ended before it could truly begin. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.